Okay, so let's try doing division in a base less than 10. So now it's really helpful to have a multiplication chart that works for that base. So in this first problem here, we've got 770 base 8 divided by 6 base 8. So having this base 8 multiplication table is really helpful. Remember, in base 8, you can only use the digits 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So this chart tells you that if you want to do 0 times 0, you would get 0. Or if you wanted to do, say, 2 times 5, so let's think about that. 2 times 5 in base 10, that makes 10. But you're not allowed to have a 10 in the base 8 system. So to change this to base 8, I'm going to divide it by 8, which is 1 with a remainder of 2. So 2 times 5 in base 8 is 10 in base 10, but since we don't have a symbol for 10 in base 8, we'll have to use 1, 2, and if you see in our chart here, 5 times 2 does make 1, 2. Now you're going to want to say 12, but remember we're in a different base, so we can't use our regular words like hundreds, thousands, 50, like those special tens, units, numbers like 30. We can only use the single digit names. Okay, so now to do the multiplication of bigger numbers, we're going to do it just like we would do in base 10. But if we get a value that's too big, meaning it uses 2 digits or it is outside the allowed digits, we're going to convert it in the middle. So there's like a lot of bookkeeping for this. So we want to do 770 divided by 6. So division is going to be the opposite of multiplication. So we're going to still use the chart, but in a little bit different way. So I'm going to put 770 in here and a 6 in here. So now, what do I times 6 by to get close to 7? So in this row here, what do I multiply 6 by to get close to 7? So that's going to be 6, which goes to 1. So to answer the question, what do I multiply 6 by to get close to 7? I multiply 6 by 1, and I'm going to do that. 6 times 1 is 6. And then we're going to subtract. So 7 take away 6 is 1, and I'm going to bring down the 7. Now again, you might want to call that 17, but I'm going to call that 1, 7. So without going over, what do I multiply 6 by to get close to 1, 7? Well, on my chart here, I could get 1, 4 by multiplying by 2. So I'm going to say 2. I'm going to do that multiplication. 6 times 2 makes a 1, 4. And then I'll subtract. So 1, 7, take away 1, 4, leaves a 3. And I'm going to bring down the 0. So now I'll ask my question one more time. What do I multiply 6 by to get close to 3, 0? So here's 3, 0. So that was multiplying by 4. So I'm going to multiply by 4. and that makes 3, 0. And when I subtract, I have 0. So 770 divided by 6 in base 8 is going to be 1, 2, 4 base 8. 1, 2, 4 in base 8. Now, as long as you have the multiplication table, the division is not so bad. When we do actual multiplication straightforward, we're basically like kind of creating a multiplication table, but we're not going to do all of those. Okay, let's try again, because if one example is not enough, let's try again. So 7612 divided by 7 base 9. So we are looking through this row here, and we're going to do long division the same way we would normally do it, but we're going to look at the chart to reference multiplication tables since we don't know our multiplication tables in base 9. So I have 7 goes into 7612. So what do I multiply 7 by to get close to 7? So I look and I'm like, okay, close to 7. That's multiplying by 1, so I'm going to put my 1 here, and I'm going to do that multiplication. It gives me 7. I'll subtract, I get 0, and then I'll bring down the 6. Now, without going over, what can I multiply 7 by to get close to 6? So I'm going to look in my row, my 7 row here. And I want to get as close to 6 as possible without going over. So that would correspond to multiplying by 0. So I'm going to put a 0 here, and I'm going to do 7 times 0, which makes 0. And when I subtract, I get 6. And now I'll bring down the 1. So what do I multiply 7 by to get close to 6, 1 without going over? So the highest number lower than 6, 1 is 5, 4. And that was multiplying by 7. So I'm going to write a 7 here, and I'm going to do 7 times 7 makes 5, 4, because we're in a different base. And when I subtract, I have to do 6, 1 minus 5, 4. And I want you to think about that in base 10, right? We would have to borrow from the 6 and then change that green 1 to an 11. But here, when I borrow 1 from the 6, it's only representing one multiple of 9. So in this subtraction, let me do this subtraction kind of over here. 6, 1 minus 5, 4. So I'm going to change this guy to a 5, and I'm going to give one of him over to this 1. So that's 1, 9 plus 1. So I'm thinking the value 10, but I'm not saying that. 10 minus 4 is 6, and then 5 minus 5 is 0. So when you borrow in base 10, you're borrowing 10 of something. When you borrow in a different base, you're borrowing whatever that base is worth. So when I do this subtraction, I get 6, and I have to bring down the 2. So now, last step, what do I multiply 7 by to get close to 6, 2? Well, it turns out that if I multiply 7 by 8, so I'll put the 8 here, and I'll do that math here, that makes 6, 2 in base 9, and when I subtract, I get 0. So 7612 divided by 7 in base 9 makes 1078. 1078. No remainder. Okay, let's try it again. So I'm in base 6. In base 6, you're only allowed to use 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when you borrow, if you have to borrow for subtraction in the middle of your long division, you're borrowing 6. So we'll take our 5311, 5311 base 6 divided by 5. So we're looking only at this 5 row here. So what do I times 5 by to get close to 5? Well, 5 is in there, so I multiply by 1, and 5 by 1 is 5. So when I subtract, there's nothing left over, and I'm going to bring down a 3. So now what do I multiply 5 by to get close to 3? Well, 0, because if I do 1, I'm too big. So I'll put a 0 here. I'll do that math, which makes 0. And when I subtract, I have 3 left, and I'm going to bring down a 1. So now 3, 1, what do I multiply 5 by to get close to 3, 1? Well, if I multiply 5 by 3, write that 3 here, then I would get 2, 3, and then I need to subtract. So again, let's do this math out here. 3, 1 minus 2, 3. So we can't do 1 minus 3 because the 3 is bigger. So I need to borrow from the second digit to make it 2. And then I'm not going to write 11 here. I'm borrowing 6. So I've really got 6 plus 1, which is a 7. So now 7 subtract 3 is 4. So there's 4 left over. And now we're going to bring down our last digit, which was a 1. And I'll say, what do I multiply 5 by to get close to 4, 1? Well, I could multiply it by 5. So I'll put a 5 here, and I'll do that math. 5 times 5 makes 4, 1, and when you subtract, you get 0. So 5311 in base 6 divided by 5 in base 6 is going to be 1035 in base 6. Again, I'm not calling that 1035, I'm just calling it 1035. Okay, let's do one more. I'm in base 5 now. So the only digits I'm allowed to use are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And when I do subtraction, I'm going to borrow. If I need to borrow from the digit to the left, I'm going to be borrowing 5. I'm not going to be borrowing 10 because here I'm in base 5. So I'm going to take 2343 divided by 3. Since we're dividing by 3, we're only looking at this row in our chart. So what do I multiply 3 by to get close to 2? Well, without going over would just be 0. So I'll put a 0 here. I'll do the multiplication. 3 times 0. That makes 0. And when I subtract, 2 minus 0 is 2. And I'll bring down the 3. So now again, without going over, what do I multiply 3 by to get close to 2, 3? Well, I could get close by getting 2, 2, and that's when I multiply by 4. So I'm going to put a 4 here, and I'm going to multiply 3 by 4. And in our chart, that makes a 2, 2. And when I subtract, I have 1 left over. So I'm going to bring down the 4. So what do I multiply 3 by to get close to 1, 4? So in my chart, I look for something close to 1, 4 without going over, and I see that's 3. So I'll do 3 times 3 makes 1, 4. And when I subtract, I get 0. But now don't stop because you still had a 3 left over at the end. So what do I times 3 by to get 3? Well, I would times it by 1. So 3 by 1 is 3, and when you subtract those, you get 0. So 2, 3, 4, 3 divided by 3 in base 5 is 4, 3, 1. So you don't have to put a leading 0 in a number.